Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into the flickering torchlight of medieval Cairo, a city that smells of jasmine, donkey dung, and the heavy, sweet scent of incense that masks a growing sense of dread. You are standing on a limestone balcony, the desert air cooling just enough to make your itchy wool tunic feel like a mild form of torture rather than a heat stroke waiting to happen. Below you, the streets of the Fatimid Caliphate are silent, not because the people are resting, but because the man in charge has some very specific, very intense ideas about how reality should function. You are about to enter the inner circle of a ruler who didn't just govern a kingdom, he seemingly tried to vibrate right out of this dimension. You probably won't survive this, mostly because the guy we are talking about once ordered all the dogs in the city to be executed because their barking interrupted his vibe, and honestly, your snoring would definitely be next on his list. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I love seeing where you guys are listening from, so go ahead and post your location and your local time in the comments. It is always cool to see how far these stories travel while we are all collectively trying to shut our brains off. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you are a courtier in the year 1010. Your boss is Al-Hakim bi Amr Allah, the sixth Fatimid Caliph. In the history books, he is often called the Mad Caliph, but if you were standing there, you would just call him Sir and hope he doesn't notice the way your knees are shaking. Al-Hakim was a man who lived his life at a different frequency. While most monarchs were busy counting gold or worrying about crusades, Al-Hakim was busy banning watercress. Why? No one really knows. He just decided he didn't like it. He also banned honey and certain types of fish. It's like having a king who is also a very aggressive, very powerful TikTok influencer who just went on a weirdly specific health kick and decided everyone else had to follow it or face the literal sword. But the most fascinating thing about Al-Hakim wasn't just his dietary restrictions, it was his relationship with the night and the sensory world. You trudge through the palace corridors, your sandals slapping against the cool marble, and you notice the air is thick, unusually thick, with the scent of lavender and musk. Al-Hakim was obsessed with perfumes and oils, but not just for the sake of smelling nice. He used them in quantities that suggest a desire for sensory alteration. Historians have noted his erratic, almost trance-like states. He would spend his nights riding his favorite donkey, Moon, into the desert hills outside Cairo, staring at the stars for hours. This wasn't just hobbyist astronomy. Imagine a modern CEO who decides to stop sleeping entirely, spends 20 hours a day microdosing on floral extracts and staring at the moon, and then comes back to the office to fire everyone who is wearing blue. That was the energy in Cairo. You follow him into the desert, the sand crunching like granulated sugar under your feet. The Caliph is ahead of you, draped in simple, unwashed clothes, because at this point in his life, he had decided luxury was a distraction. He is essentially the medieval version of a billionaire who only wears the same gray t-shirt every day to save brain power, except his gray t-shirt is a rough wool robe that probably smells like a damp basement. He is seeking a higher state of being, a connection to the divine that seems to be facilitated by his extreme sleep deprivation and his intense focus on the celestial bodies. One mainstream historical fact about Al-Hakim is that he founded the Dar al-Ilm, or the House of Knowledge, in 1005 It was a massive library and center for study that predates the great universities of Europe. He was a man of immense intellect, a patron of the sciences who wanted to understand the universe. But as you watch him mutter to the stars, you start to wonder if he's trying to understand the universe or just escape it. There is a fine line between a genius and someone who has spent way too much time sniffing concentrated lavender oil and not enough time eating a balanced meal. Then there is the quirky, fringe tidbit that really hammers home how strange life was under his rule. Al-Hakim once issued a decree that people should work at night and sleep during the day. For a few years, Cairo became a 24-hour city of shadows. Imagine trying to buy groceries at 3 a.m. by the light of a smoky oil lamp because your king decided the sun was a bit too mainstream. The markets were bustling in the dead of night, the smell of fried street food mixing with the heavy desert dampness. It was a total inversion of reality, a collective hallucination forced upon an entire population. It's the kind of move you make when you've lost touch with the rhythm of the human body and have replaced it with the rhythm of your own internal, chemical-induced clock. You feel the exhaustion deep in your marrow, that heavy, leaden feeling in your eyelids as you try to stay awake during the caliph's midnight processions. The flickering torches cast long, dancing shadows against the city walls, making the stone look like it's breathing. It's disorienting. It's meant to be. Al-Hakim seemed to thrive in this state of flux. He was a man who claimed to be the representative of God on earth, and eventually, some accounts suggest he started believing he was even more than that. This brings us to the core of the mystery surrounding him. Historians still argue whether his erratic behavior was a result of a mental health condition like paranoid schizophrenia or a calculated political strategy to consolidate absolute power by keeping everyone in a constant state of confusion and terror. When you look at his life through the lens of someone chasing a high, his actions start to form a pattern. He wasn't just a king, he was a seeker. Whether it was through the use of potent oils, extreme fasting, or the sheer psychological rush of having total life and death power over millions, he was always pushing the boundaries of the mundane. He wanted to feel something that the average person couldn't even imagine. It's like he was trying to hack his own brain using the limited tools of the 11th century. If medicine is really just polite torture with a theology degree, then Al-Hakim's self-prescribed regimen was a masterclass in psychological experimentation. Think about the sensory detail of his world. The grit of the desert sand that gets into every crevice of your clothing. The pungent, metallic smell of the Nile when the water is low. The way the oil lamps hiss and sputter, casting a greasy yellow light that makes everyone look like a ghost. This was the backdrop for a man who was increasingly becoming a ghost himself. He was withdrawing from the world of the living, spending more and more time in the silence of the hills. And then, one night in February 1021, he just left. He rode his donkey into the Muqaddam hills and never came back. When his search parties finally went out, they found his clothes, neatly folded or perhaps torn, accounts vary, but no caliph. Just his donkey, still wandering the plateau. It is the ultimate dropping out story. Did he achieve some final, chemically or spiritually induced state of transcendence? Or did he just fall victim to the very real, very earthly dangers of the desert? You stand there in the silence he left behind, the smell of lavender still faintly clinging to the air, wondering if he finally found the high he was looking for, or if the reality he tried so hard to bend finally snapped back and swallowed him whole. You realize that being a royal isn't all gold crowns and feasts. Sometimes it's just a lonely ride into the dark, fueled by a brain that refuses to turn off. As the memory of Al-Hakim's lavender-scented desert fade into the morning mist, you find yourself transported several hundred years forward and a few hundred miles north. You are no longer in the sparse, frantic energy of Cairo. Instead, you are standing in the heart of Constantinople, or Istanbul if you're feeling modern, during the height of the Ottoman Empire. The air here is different. It's heavier, wetter, filled with the briny tang of the Bosphorus and the smell of roasting meat and thick, sludge-like coffee. You are wearing a robe of such heavy, embroidered silk that it feels like wearing a very expensive, very itchy carpet. Your boots are damp from the mud of the palace gardens, and your head is slightly spinning from the sheer scale of the Topkapi Palace. You are a minor official in the court of Suleiman the Magnificent, a man whose name sounds like a heavy metal band, but whose life was more like a high-stakes chess game, played while underwater. Suleiman is the most powerful man in the world, the shadow of God on earth, but as you watch him from across the courtyard, he looks less like a shadow and more like a man trying to manage a very long-running headache. Being the Sultan is essentially like being the CEO of a company that spans 3 continents, has no HR department, and where your board of directors is composed of elite janissaries who might decide to fire you, literally, if their soup isn't salty enough. To cope with the stress of managing millions of people and a harem that is its own complex geopolitical entity, Suleiman turned to something a bit more potent than Al-Hakim's floral oils. He turned to opium. Now, opium in the 16th century wasn't viewed with the same just say no stigma we have today. It was more like an aggressive form of ibuprofen that also happened to make you see God. One mainstream historical fact about Suleiman is that he was known as Kanuni, or the lawgiver. He completely overhauled the Ottoman legal system, creating a code that would last for centuries. But while he was writing these laws, he was also dealing with agonizing physical pain. He suffered from gout, a condition often called the disease of kings, which is basically your big toe deciding to turn into a red-hot coal because you ate too much venison. Medicine back then was less like a science and more like an ongoing edible experiment, and for gout, the experiment usually involved opium. You watch as a servant brings the Sultan a small ornate porcelain bowl. Inside is a substance called majun. It's a sweet, spicy paste made of honey, pepper, cinnamon, and a very generous helping of processed poppy juice. Imagine a medieval edible that tastes like a gingerbread cookie but packs the punch of a sledgehammer to the nervous system. As Suleiman takes a spoonful, you see the tension leave his shoulders. The magnificent mask slips just a fraction, and for a moment, he is just a man whose feet don't hurt anymore. The palace bells, which serve as the city's giant bronze alarm clocks, ring out for the afternoon prayer, but to the Sultan, they probably sound like they're being muffled by a thick layer of velvet. There is a quirky fringe tidbit that suggests the use of opium wasn't just medicinal for the Ottoman elite, it was a lifestyle. There were opium dens in the city that were more like high-end lounge clubs where poets and scholars would gather to expand their horizons. They called it the food of the soul. Imagine a group of bearded intellectuals sitting around in a room that smells like burnt sugar and old socks, trying to write the 16th century equivalent of a deep dive Twitter thread, while their brains are slowly melting into the floor cushions. It's a bit of a contrast to the image of the terrifying Ottoman war machine, isn't it? The same soldiers who were laying siege to Vienna were often the same guys who wouldn't start their day without a little poppy kick in their morning coffee. As you stand there, the sun begins to set, turning the domes of the Hagia Sophia into glowing embers. You feel the weight of the empire all around you. It's claustrophobic. The palace is a labyrinth of secrets, and you've heard the whispers. Historians still argue whether Suleiman's later life decisions, specifically the execution of his most capable son, Mustafa, were influenced by the long-term cognitive effects of his opium use or simply the brutal necessity of dynastic politics. It's a chilling thought. Did the shadow of God cast such a dark shadow because his mind was clouded by the very substance that allowed him to walk without screaming? The sensory experience of the Ottoman court is overwhelming. The rustle of silk, the clinking of gold coins, the constant low-level hum of thousands of people living in close quarters. It's like being trapped inside a giant, beautiful, gold-plated pressure cooker. You can see why someone would want to check out, even if just for an hour or two. You remember that crocodile dung sunscreen Al-Hakim might have used in Egypt? Well, here, the remedies are a bit more sophisticated, but no less mind-altering. The doctors, with their long robes and their theology degrees, would tell you that the opium is balancing the sultan's humors. In reality, it's just making the impossible burden of being a living god slightly more tolerable. You trudge back to your quarters, your feet aching in your damp boots. You pass a fountain where the water splashes with a rhythmic, hypnotic sound. The medieval version of white noise. You think about the Sultan in his private chambers, perhaps taking another small spoonful of his spicy paste, watching the smoke from an incense burner curl toward the ceiling. To him, the borders of his empire might seem to blur and stretch, the maps on his wall becoming fluid and alive. In that state, the Janissaries aren't a threat. The treasury is always full, and his sons are still young boys. Playing in the garden, it's a seductive lie, a golden haze that blankets the cold, hard reality of the throne. As you lie down on your own thin mattress, the scratchy wool blanket finally feeling a bit more comfortable as you drift toward sleep, you realize that history isn't just a list of dates and battles. It's a story of people trying to survive their own lives. Whether it's a caliph staring at the stars or a sultan numbing his gouty feet, the high wasn't about the pleasure, it was about the escape. You close your eyes, the smell of the Bosphorus fading, replaced by the ghost of a cinnamon and poppy scent that seems to hang in the air of every empire at its peak. Tomorrow, the sun will rise, the alarm clocks will ring, and the magnificent will have to be magnificent again. But for now, in the quiet of the night, even a sultan is allowed to just be. The briny air of the Bosphorus and the sweet, cloying scent of Ottoman poppy paste linger in your mind like a half-remembered dream as you find yourself suddenly standing in a much colder, much damper climate. You are in England now, specifically the sprawling, red brick labyrinth of Hampton Court Palace in the late 1540s. The air here doesn't smell of jasmine or sea salt. It smells of wood smoke, damp wool, and if you get too close to the royal apartments, something sweet and sickly that's trying very hard to hide the smell of rotting meat. You are a member of the King's Privy Chamber, which basically means you are a high-end personal assistant whose primary job is to keep a massive, irritable, and very medicated man from losing his temper and having you sent to the tower. You trudge across the great hall, your boots clicking on the stone floor, which is covered in a fresh layer of rushes. These rushes are meant to act like a giant natural carpet, but in reality, they just trap old bones, spilled ale, and the occasional dead mouse. It's like walking on a very gross, very crunchy history of last week's dinner. Ahead of you is Henry VIII. He isn't the slim, athletic prince from the history book paintings anymore. He is a mountain of a man, a literal giant of his era, but a giant who is held together by expensive silks and a very elaborate pharmaceutical regimen. If Suleiman used opium to find peace, Henry is using a literal pharmacy of medieval substances just to stay upright. Being the King of England is a stressful gig, especially when you've broken up with the Pope, started your own church, and are on your sixth wife. It's a lot of administrative work, and Henry's body is starting to file a formal protest. His legs are the main problem. One mainstream historical fact about Henry VIII is that in 1536, he suffered a horrific jousting accident. His horse fell on him and he was unconscious for 2 hours. It was a turning point that ended his days as a warrior king and began his life as a man plagued by chronic weeping ulcers on his legs. These wounds never healed and they required constant dressing with salves that were more like chemical cocktails than medicine. You watch as the royal apothecaries approach him with a heavy, silver-bound cabinet. This is the Cabinet of Potency, though that's just a fancy name for Henry's personal drug stash. Inside are various tinctures and plasters, many of which Henry designed himself. You see, Henry wasn't just a patient. He was a hobbyist pharmacist. He spent hours in his private laboratory, mixing ingredients like a medieval mad scientist who also happens to own the country. There is a quirky fringe tidbit that highlights this obsession. Henry actually had his own brand of medicinal plasters known as the King's Own Plaster. It contained white lead, red lead, lily, and a whole lot of plant extracts that were designed to numb the excruciating pain of his legs. Imagine a man who is essentially the 16th century version of an aging football star who refuses to retire and instead starts mixing his own painkillers in his garage. Except his garage is a palace and his painkillers are being applied by a team of terrified servants. As the apothecary applies a new bandage soaked in a mixture of opium and hemlock, you can see the king's eyes glaze over. The sharp, jagged edge of his pain is blunted, replaced by a heavy, narcotic fog. This is his high, a chemical buffer between his regal duties and the agonizing reality of his physical decay. Medicine in this room is really just polite torture with a theology degree, but for Henry, it's the only thing that keeps the Lion of England from turning into a puddle of misery. The atmosphere in the room is suffocatingly dense. The walls are covered in massive tapestries that look like they're watching you, and the flickering candlelight makes Henry's shadow dance across the ceiling like a bloated ghost. You feel the weight of his mood swings, which are as unpredictable as a summer storm. One moment, he's laughing about a ribald joke, and the next, he's ordering the arrest of a courtier for a perceived slight. This brings us to a point of intense interest for those who study the mind. Historians still argue whether Henry's radical personality shift from a benevolent prince to a paranoid tyrant was caused by the brain injury from his jousting accident, or the cumulative psychological effects of chronic pain and long-term exposure to the heavy metals and narcotics in his medication. It's a fascinating, dark thought. Was the Reformation partially fueled by a man whose brain was being marinated in lead and opium? You stand there, trying to be invisible, while the king mumbles to himself about his legacy and his lack of a stable male heir. To him, the world probably feels like it's vibrating. The tapestries might seem to move, the figures in the woven scene stepping out of the fabric. In his medicated state, the line between his will and reality probably blurs until he feels like he can simply decree the world into whatever shape he wants. It's a dangerous kind of high, the high of absolute power combined with a mind that is slowly being untethered from its moorings. You remember that spicy poppy paste Suleiman used? This is much more chaotic. Henry's cabinet contains things like mandrake and henbane, plants that are members of the nightshade family and can cause vivid hallucinations if not used with extreme care. The doctors tell the king it's to help him sleep, but you've seen him in the middle of the night, wandering the halls in his nightshirt, talking to the ghosts of his former advisors. It's a scene out of a horror movie, but it's just another Tuesday at the Tudor court. The smell of his king's own plaster follows him like a chemical wake, a mix of lilies and something metallic that sticks to the back of your throat. As the night deepens, the king finally settles into a heavy, snoring slumber. The servants move on tiptoe, afraid to wake the beast. You trudge back to your own small chamber, the cold of the stone floor seeping through your boots. You think about how strange it is that the most powerful people in the world are often the ones most dependent on a little bottle of juice or a smear of herbal grease. Henry's high isn't about pleasure, it's about survival. It's about building a wall of narcotics between himself and the fact that his body is failing him. You lie down on your bed, the scratchy wool of your blanket a reminder of the mundane world. In the distance, you can hear the bells of London ringing out, the city's giant bronze alarm clocks telling everyone that another day has passed. Tomorrow, the king will wake up, his legs will scream in protest, and the cabinet of potency will be opened once more. The cycle of pain and numbing will continue. A slow motion car crash of a reign that is being steered by a man who is only half present. You close your eyes, the smell of wood smoke and old lilies fading into the dark, and you realize that being a king isn't a gift. It's a sentence, and the drugs are just the guards who make sure you stay in your cell. As the English bells fade into a distant echo and the smell of Henry's lilies dissolves into the frost, you find yourself transported from the damp bricks of Hampton Court to the cold, imposing stone of the Moscow Kremlin. The air here doesn't just bite, it chews. It's a dry, brittle cold that makes your breath bloom in front of you like a frantic ghost. You are no longer wearing silk. You're wrapped in heavy furs that smell faintly of wet dog and old cedar, and beneath that, more of that familiar, itchy wool. The lighting is different too. There are no wide windows here, just narrow slits in the stone that let in a pale, weak light, supplemented by a forest of beeswax candles that drip and hiss in the draft. You are a clerk in the service of Ivan IV, a man history will eventually label the terrible, though right now, you just know him as the guy who makes you want to hide behind a pillar whenever he enters the room. Ivan is the first to officially take the title of Tsar of all the Russias, and he's currently busy turning a collection of scattered principalities into a unified, massive empire. One mainstream historical fact about Ivan is that he was a brilliant reformer in his early years, centralizing the government and creating the first Russian parliament of estates. He was a high achiever, the kind of person who would have had 3 different side hustles and a perfectly curated LinkedIn profile if he lived today. But as you watch him pace the floor of his private chambers, you notice something is deeply off. His eyes are wide and bloodshot, and he's grinding his teeth with a sound like two stones being rubbed together. He isn't just stressed from statecraft. His brain is being slowly simmered in a very specific, very toxic medieval remedy. You see, Ivan has a problem. He's in constant pain, spine issues, possibly syphilis, and a growing, gnawing paranoia that everyone is out to get him. To treat his ailments, his doctors have prescribed a variety of ointments and miracle waters heavy with mercury. In the 16th century, mercury was seen as a sort of silver liquid gold, a holy grail of medicine that could cure everything from skin rashes to broken hearts. In reality, it was like trying to fix a delicate watch by pouring liquid lead into the gears. Medicine is really just polite torture with a theology degree, and Ivan's silver water is the ultimate proof. You watch as he rubs a thick metallic paste onto his joints. It's a sensory nightmare. The paste is cold, greasy, and smells like a chemistry set left out in the sun. As the mercury seeps into his skin, it enters his bloodstream and heads straight for his nervous system. If Suleiman's opium was a soft velvet blanket and Henry's narcotics were a thick fog, Ivan's mercury high is a jagged electric storm. It doesn't calm him down, it dials his intensity up to 11. It's like his mind is a cable television signal that's getting constant, violent interference. 1 minute the picture is clear, and the next it's all static and screaming. There is a quirky fringe tidbit that adds a layer of gruesome reality to this. In the 1960s, Soviet scientists exhumed Ivan's remains for study. They found that his bones contained mercury levels hundreds of times higher than what is considered safe. He wasn't just mad in the traditional sense. He was literally being poisoned from the inside out by his own medicine. Imagine a modern world where your doctor prescribes you a daily smoothie made of old batteries and thermometers. That was Ivan's daily routine. He was living in a constant state of heavy metal toxicity, which causes irritability, tremors, and, most famously for Ivan, explosive, uncontrollable rage. You trudge through the hallways of the Kremlin, your boots crunching on the thin layer of ice that forms near the doorways. You pass members of the Oprichnina, Ivan's private army of black-clad enforcers who ride black horses and carry severed dog heads on their saddles. They are essentially a 16th century goth death cult that doubles as a secret police force. The vibe in the palace is one of total, suffocating dread. You never know if a greeting will be met with a smile or a spear. Historians still argue whether Ivan's descent into the terrible was a calculated political move to crush the boyars, or if he was a victim of a biological catastrophe, a mind shattered by mercury poisoning and the loss of his beloved first wife, Anastasia. As the night drags on, you hear the muffled sounds of the Tsar's footsteps. He doesn't sleep much anymore. The mercury has seen to that. He wanders the dark corridors, his shadow elongated and distorted by the flickering candlelight, looking like a skeletal crow. To him, the stone walls probably feel like they're closing in, the faces in the religious icons on the walls watching him with judgmental, shimmering eyes. In his state of toxic high, every whisper is a conspiracy, and every shadow is an assassin. He's trapped in a feedback loop of pain and poison, and the empire is forced to ride along with him. Think about the sensory detail of this frozen nightmare. The smell of the incense in the private chapels, thick enough to choke a horse. The way the cold air makes your nose hairs freeze. The metallic taste that seems to hang in the back of your throat just by being near the Tsar's quarters. It's an environment of total sensory overload. You remember the king's own plaster that Henry used? Well, Ivan's mercury rubs are even more transformative, but in the worst way possible. He's not seeking an escape from reality. He's accidentally creating a new, terrifying version of it where he is the only person who can be trusted. And even he is starting to doubt himself. You see him sitting at a heavy oak table, staring at a map of his expanding borders. To a normal person, the map represents land and people. To Ivan, in his mercury-addled state, it probably looks like a living organism, a beast that needs to be fed or it will turn on him. He picks up his heavy, iron-tipped staff, the same one he will eventually use to accidentally kill his own son in a fit of rage, and taps it rhythmically against the floor. Thump, thump, thump. It's the heartbeat of a dying sanity. As you finally retreat to your own cold bed, pulling the heavy furs up to your chin, you realize that the highs of history aren't always about pleasure or even numbing the pain. Sometimes they are about a slow, agonizing transformation. Ivan didn't choose to be a mercury addict. He chose to be a patient, and the medicine stole his mind. You close your eyes, the image of the flickering icons and the smell of the metallic paste lingering in your mind. Tomorrow, the Tsar will wake up with trembling hands and a burning brain, and the empire will tremble with him. You realize that the crown isn't just heavy because of the gold, it's heavy because of the chemicals used to keep the head wearing it from falling apart. The alarm clocks of Moscow, the deep, booming church bells, will ring soon enough, but for now, there is only the silence of the frost and the slow, poisonous drip of the silver water in the Tsar's veins. You leave behind the metallic, freezing bite of Moscow and find yourself standing in the damp, gray autumn of 14th century Paris. The air here doesn't freeze your lungs. Instead, it clings to you like a wet wool coat you can't take off. It smells of wood smoke, stale wine, and the pungent, earthy scent of the Seine River, which is essentially the city's open-air plumbing system. You are a royal valet in the Hotel Saint-Paul, the residence of King Charles VI of France. You are walking down a long corridor lined with thick, heavy tapestries that depict hunting scenes, but the faces of the hounds look strangely human in the flickering torchlight. Your boots make no sound because you've been ordered to wrap them in soft felt. In this palace, noise is the enemy, and sudden movements are a crime. You are entering the world of Charles the Well-Beloved, or as the gossips in the marketplace call him, Charles the Mad. If Ivan the Terrible was a jagged electric storm of mercury, Charles Issyk is a fragile, translucent dream. One mainstream historical fact about Charles is that he started his reign with immense promise, earning his well-beloved nickname by reforming the tax system and stabilizing the government. But in 1392, while leading an army to Brittany, he suddenly snapped. He attacked his own knights, killing several before being restrained. It was the first of many bouts of madness that would define the rest of his 30-year reign. To manage these episodes, his physicians turned to the only thing they knew: heavy, mind-numbing sedation. Imagine you are standing in the king's bedchamber. The room is dim, the windows shuttered against the evil humors of the night air. Charles is sitting in a chair, but he's not moving. He hasn't moved for hours. He's wearing a bizarre outfit. His silk tunic is reinforced with long, thin rods of iron sewn into the lining, and he's surrounded by thick velvet cushions. Why? Because Charles believes he is made of glass. This is the glass delusion, a quirky fringe tidbit that was actually a documented phenomenon among the medieval elite. He is terrified that if he moves too quickly, or if someone touches him, he will literally shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. It's like being the 14th century version of an extremely high-end, extremely fragile smartphone that doesn't have a case. To keep the king from breaking, his doctors provide him with cures that are basically medieval liquid sedation. They give him syrups heavy with lettuce, opium, henbane, and large quantities of strong, spiced wine. While Suleiman used opium to manage gout and Henry VIII used it to numb his legs, Charles is being kept in a permanent state of chemical bubble wrap. The goal isn't to make him feel good. It's to make him so sluggish that he won't try to run or jump and accidentally shatter himself. You watch as he takes a sip of a dark, bitter decoction. His eyes, already glassy, seem to lose focus entirely. He's drifting into a state where the world is soft, muffled, and, most importantly, safe. Being a royal valet here is like being a technician in a very prestigious psychiatric ward where the patient also happens to own your soul. You have to be incredibly careful with your words. One wrong sentence could trigger a bout. Historians still argue whether Charles VI suffered from late-onset schizophrenia, a form of bipolar disorder, or perhaps the hereditary condition known as porphyria, the same madness that would later plague King George III. Whatever the cause, the remedies of the time were less like medicine and more like hitting a computer with a hammer to see if it starts working again. Medicine is really just polite torture with a theology degree, and for Charles, the torture was being trapped in a mind that told him he was an inanimate object, while his doctors kept him too drugged to argue. The sensory details of this room are stifling. There's the smell of theriac, a complex medieval panacea made of dozens of ingredients including viper flesh and fermented herbs, which hangs in the air like a heavy medicinal fog. There's the sound of the king's shallow breathing and the rhythmic tick-tick of a distant water clock. The medieval version of an app that tracks your screen time, but much more depressing. You remember the king's own plaster from Henry's court? Well, Charles has something similar, but it's more of a king's own sedative, a concoction designed to keep the glass king from experiencing any emotion too strongly. One of the most famous and tragic moments of his reign was the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men. During a wedding celebration, Charles and 5 of his lords dressed up as wild men in costumes made of linen soaked in pitch and covered in shaggy hemp. A stray torch set them on fire. Charles only survived because his young aunt, the Duchess of Berry, threw her voluminous skirts over him to smother the flames. Imagine the psychological toll that would take on a man who already thinks he's made of glass. After that, his dependence on calming tinctures only grew. He spent months at a time refusing to bathe or change his clothes, wandering the palace like a ghost. You trudge over to the window and peek through a gap in the shutters. Below, the streets of Paris are dark, save for the occasional lantern of a night watchman. The bells of Notre Dame ring out, the giant bronze alarm clocks of the soul, reminding everyone that even in madness, time moves forward. To the king, those bells probably sound like someone is striking a giant glass bowl, a vibration that threatens his very existence. You turn back to him and see that the sedative has taken full effect. His head has slumped forward and he is finally asleep, a fragile vessel of a man floating in a sea of poppy-infused wine. You feel a strange mix of pity and terror. This is the high of the broken, a state where reality is so terrifying that the only solution is to turn the volume down on your own consciousness. Charles isn't seeking a throne or a conquest. He's just seeking a moment where he doesn't feel like he's about to break. You think back to Al-Hakim's lavender trances and Ivan's mercury rages. Each of these men was using the substances of their time to navigate a reality that was too big, too painful, or too strange for them to handle. As you prepare to blow out the last candle, leaving the room in a soft, velvety darkness, you realize that the crown is a prison, and the drugs are the only windows out. You lie down on your small pallet at the foot of the king's bed, the scratchy wool of your tunic a reminder that you, at least, are made of flesh and bone. Tomorrow, the king will wake up. He will check his arms and legs to see if they've cracked in the night, and the cycle of sedation will begin again. You close your eyes, the smell of theriac and old wine fading, and you hope that in his dreams, the glass king is finally something that can't be broken. The damp, chilly drafts of a Parisian palace and the fragile image of a glass king dissolve into the shimmering heat of the Arabian Peninsula. You are now standing in the early 8th century in the bustling heart of the Umayyad Caliphate. The air here is a dry, golden weight that tastes of dust and expensive resins. It's a sensory world away from the wet wool of France. Here, you are wearing light, breathable linens that still manage to feel itchy because of the fine desert sand that finds its way into every seam. You are an attendant in the court of Umarset, a ruler often called the pious caliph. But as you walk through the shadowed porticos of the palace, you realize that piety in the medieval world often walked hand in hand with some very potent botanical assistance. Umar II was a man trying to steer a massive, expanding empire toward a simpler, more spiritual path. One mainstream historical fact about Umar II is that he is widely considered the first mujaddid, or renewer of the faith, known for his extreme asceticism and for abolishing the practice of cursing political rivals from the pulpit. He was a kind of leader who wanted to cut through the bureaucratic noise and return to the pure roots of his culture. But returning to your roots in the 8th century Middle East often involved engaging with the plants that grew there, specifically the resinous, sticky substance known as hashish. You trudge across the sun-drenched courtyard, the heat radiating off the white stone like a physical blow, and step into the cool, incense-heavy atmosphere of the private audience chamber. While the later assassins would make hashish famous as a tool for political manipulation, in these early days it was often viewed through a more mystical lens. To the devout, certain herbs of the field weren't just distractions, they were keys to unlocking a deeper level of prayer or a way to endure the crushing loneliness of supreme leadership. You see the caliph sitting on a low divan, surrounded by scrolls and the remains of a very simple meal of dates and water. He doesn't look like a man enjoying the spoils of conquest. He looks like a man who has been trying to download the secrets of the universe on a very slow connection. There is a quirky, fringe tidbit regarding the early use of cannabis in the Islamic world. It was sometimes called the grass of the fakirs, or the green morsel. Some early accounts suggest that royal figures and holy men used it not for a party high, but to achieve a state of fana, or the annihilation of the self. Imagine a medieval version of a high-powered executive who spends their weekends at a silent retreat eating special gummies to remember who they are underneath the suit. For Umar, The morsel was a way to quiet the constant clattering noise of tax disputes and border skirmishes so he could focus on what he believed was his divine mission. You watch as he inhales the smoke from a small brazier where a piece of dark aromatic resin is smoldering. The smell is pungent, earthy, piney, and thick, like a forest fire in a bottle of perfume. As the smoke fills the room, the sharp edges of the day begin to soften. This isn't the heavy, leaden sedation of Charles VI or the aggressive mercury hum of Ivan. It's a more cerebral, drifting state. To the caliph, the rhythmic chanting of the Quran from the nearby mosque, the city's spiritual alarm clocks probably begin to sound like the very fabric of reality being woven together in real time. Being an attendant here requires a delicate touch. You aren't just a servant, you are a witness to the internal struggle of a man trying to be a saint while holding a sword. Historians still argue whether the early widespread use of hashish among the Sufis and certain Umayyad royals was truly for spiritual enlightenment, or if it was a cultural habit inherited from the vast, diverse territories they had recently conquered. It's the classic chicken or the egg debate of history. Did the plant influence the philosophy, or did the philosophy seek out the plant? Either way, the result was a court where the high was treated with a strange, somber respect. The sensory details of the Umayyad court are vibrant and dizzying. The taste of the thick, bitter coffee that makes your heart race. The sound of the wind whistling through the palm fronds like 1,000 whispers. The way the light changes as the sun dips below the horizon, turning the desert into a sea of violet and deep orange. You remember that spicy poppy paste from Suleiman's court? This is different. This is about clarity, or at least the illusion of it. In this state, the caliph might feel that he can see the hidden connections between all his subjects, from the merchants in Damascus to the farmers on the banks of the Indus. However, medicine is really just polite torture with a theology degree, and even the green morsel had its downsides. Overuse could lead to a profound melancholy, a withdrawal from the world that could make a ruler forget to actually, rule. You see it in Umar's eyes as he stares at a map. He isn't looking at the borders, he's looking at the spaces between the borders. He is becoming a ghost in his own palace. He famously gave away his wife's jewelry to the public treasury and simplified his life to the point of poverty. While his peers saw this as extreme piety, a cynical courtier might have seen it as the ultimate minimalist trip. As the night air finally cools, the scent of the resin fades, replaced by the smell of damp earth as the palace gardens are watered. You trudge back to your own quarters, your mind swimming with the philosophical weight of what you've seen. You realize that for Umar too, the high was a burden as much as a relief. It was a tool to reach a state of grace that his position as caliph made almost impossible to maintain. He was a man trying to be a monk in a world of warriors, and the hashish was the bridge he built to span that gap. You lie down on your thin mat, the silence of the desert night settling over you like a heavy blanket. The alarm clocks of the morning prayer will wake you soon enough, calling everyone back to the struggle of the material world. But for a few hours, the palace is quiet and the caliph is at peace. You close your eyes, the image of the smoldering brazier and the green morsel lingering in your mind, and you realize that even in the 8th century, people were looking for a way to turn down the noise of existence. Whether it's through prayer, politics, or a bit of resinous smoke, everyone is just trying to find a version of the truth they can live with. Tomorrow the sun will rise, the empire will demand its tribute, and the pious caliph will have to decide once again which world he truly belongs to. The dry, resinous air of the Umayyad court and the silent desert nights of Umar II vanish, replaced by the salt-sprayed, chaotic energy of the Third Crusade in the late 12th century. You are no longer in a stable palace. You are in a mobile city of tents, horses, and heavy iron. The air smells of charred wood, the iron tang of blood, and the omnipresent, suffocating scent of unwashed men living in leather armor. You are a squire in the service of Richard the Farid of England, famously known as Richard the Lionheart. You are walking through the camp outside the walls of Acre, your boots sinking into the churned-up mud that is a mixture of Mediterranean rain and the refuse of 10,000 soldiers. Your itchy wool tunic is now layered under a heavy hauberk of chainmail that bites into your shoulders with every step. A constant reminder that life here is cheap and survival is a literal daily grind. Richard is a man of legendary proportions, a warrior king who seems to exist on a different physical plane than the rest of humanity. One mainstream historical fact about Richard the Lionheart is that he spent very little of his 10-year reign in England. He was a king of the road, a professional soldier who was more at home in a siege trench than a throne room. But even a lion has his limits. During the siege of Acre, Richard fell deathly ill with a condition called Lenardy, which most historians think was scurvy, but it left him bedridden while his army struggled. To keep his spirit and body from collapsing, Richard turned to the very people he was fighting. He entered into a strange, respectful correspondence with his rival, Saladin, who sent him frozen snow from the mountains and baskets of fruit. But according to the more whispered tales of the camp, Richard also sampled something much more potent. You enter the king's pavilion, a cavernous space of silk and shadows. Richard is reclining on a pile of furs, his face pale but his eyes burning with a restless, feverish light. He is consuming a substance that the locals call electuaries, thick, honey-based medicinal pastes. But these aren't your standard English herbal remedies. These are the elixirs of the East, potentially containing extracts of the poppy, the hemp plant, and even the assassin's weed. There is a quirky fringe tidbit that suggests Richard's legendary stamina and his almost suicidal bravery in battle were fueled by these potent Middle Eastern tinctures. Imagine a medieval elite athlete who discovered a local pre-workout supplement that also happens to be a powerful narcotic. It's like Richard was trying to maintain a permanent state of battle-ready euphoria to mask the fact that his body was literally falling apart from vitamin C deficiency. You watch as the king takes a small silver spoon of a dark, shimmering syrup. Within minutes, the tremor in his hand stops. The pain in his joints, which felt like jagged glass, recedes into a dull, manageable hum. This is his Crusader High, a chemical armor that allows him to put on his helmet and lead a charge when he should be in a hospital bed. Medicine back then was really just polite torture with a theology degree, but in the hands of the Saracen physicians whose knowledge had trickled into the Crusader camps, it was also a sophisticated art of mind alteration. The atmosphere in the tent is electric with the sound of sharpening swords and the low murmur of advisors discussing the next day's assault. You feel the weight of the king's presence, a man who lives for the high of the charge, the rush of the adrenaline, and the numbing relief of his medicine. Historians still argue whether Richard's famous friendship and exchange of gifts with Saladin were purely diplomatic maneuvers or if they were a bridge for the exchange of sophisticated medical knowledge and substances that were unknown in the West. It's a fascinating thought. The Lionheart legendary courage might have been partly bottled in a Damascus apothecary. The sensory details of the Crusader camp are visceral. The taste of the dry, hard biscuits that break your teeth. The sound of the Mediterranean wind howling through the tent ropes like a dying animal. The way the light of the oil lamps dances on Richard's discarded shield, making the painted lions look like they're trying to leap off the wood. You remember that green morsel the Caliph used? Well, Richard's elixirs are a far cry from a monk's meditation. This is about power. This is about being able to stand on the walls of a burning city and feel like a god while the world around you is turning into a slaughterhouse. But even a lion has to come down. You've seen him in the gray hours before dawn, when the elixirs wear off and the Lenardee returns with a vengeance. He becomes irritable, his skin sallow and itchy under his fine linens. He paces a small area of his tent like a caged beast, his mind racing with maps and maneuvers he can't quite execute yet. It's a jagged, uncomfortable descent back to reality. He's a man addicted to the peak of the battle and the peak of the bottle. To him, the alarm clocks of the camp, the blaring silver trumpets that signal the start of the day, are a call to re-enter the haze of his legendary persona. You trudge back to your own pile of straw, your bones aching from the damp. You think about how strange it is that these two worlds, the Christian West and the Islamic East, are clashing so violently, yet their leaders are sharing the same secrets for surviving the madness of it all. Richard isn't seeking a quiet prayer or a glass palace. He's seeking the strength to stay a legend just one day longer. The high isn't an escape from his duty, it's the only way he can perform it. As you close your eyes, the smell of the sea and the metallic scent of the king's syrup mingling in the air, you realize that history is written by the people who managed to stay awake and alert enough to seize it by any means necessary. Richard the Lionheart wasn't just a king of England, he was a king of the moment, a man who used the alchemy of his enemies to fuel the fire of his own myth. Tomorrow, the trumpets will sound, the lion will drink his silver spoon of courage, and the sands of the Holy Land will drink the blood of more men. You close your eyes, the flickering shadow of a lion on the tent wall, the last thing you see, and you hope that in your dreams there is a place where the wars have ended and the only thing people drink is cool, clear water. The clashing steel and salty spray of the Crusader coast fade into the background, replaced by the heavy, humid air of 14th century England. You aren't in a tent anymore, but you aren't exactly in a comfortable palace either. You are in the Royal Hunting Lodge at Woodstock, the air thick with the smell of wet dogs, roasted venison, and the sharp, medicinal tang of an apothecary's workshop. You are a physician's apprentice to the court of Edward III, a king who, much like Richard the Lionheart, spent his life defining himself through the high of war, specifically the 100 Years' War. But while Richard sought the stimulants of the East, Edward is currently in need of something much deeper, something that can pull a man back from the brink of absolute physical exhaustion. You are wearing a heavy tunic of green wool that's seen better days, and your hands are stained a suspicious shade of brown from grinding roots all morning. Edward III is the quintessential medieval king, chivalrous, aggressive, and currently suffering from the cumulative toll of decades of campaigning in France. One mainstream historical fact about Edward III is that he was the founder of the Order of the Garter, the highest order of chivalry in England. He was a man obsessed with the imagery of King Arthur, trying to recreate a golden age of knights and honor. But behind the heraldry and the glittering tournaments, Edward was a man who lived in a state of constant physical stress. As he aged, he suffered from a series of strokes and various infirmities of the joints, a polite way of saying his body was screaming for a break that his ego wouldn't allow. You watch your master, the royal physician, as he carefully handles a gnarled, twisted root that looks disturbingly like a tiny, distorted human being. This is the mandrake. In the 14th century, the mandrake wasn't just a plant, it was a legend. There is a quirky, fringe tidbit about its harvest. People believed that when pulled from the ground, the root would emit a scream so piercing it could kill anyone who heard it. To avoid this, they would tie a dog to the plant, walk a safe distance away, and lure the dog with a piece of meat so the animal would pull the root and take the death curse for them. It sounds like something out of a low-budget horror movie, but for the people in this room, it was a very real, very dangerous procedure. The goal today isn't a party high for the king, but a state of artificial sleep known as dwale. This was a medieval anesthetic, a potent mixture of bile, vinegar, hemlock, and a heavy dose of mandrake. Imagine a medieval version of a nighttime sleep aid that has the potential to accidentally put you into a coma if the pharmacist's scale is slightly off. Medicine is really just polite torture with a theology degree, and dwale was the ultimate double-edged sword. It could numb the pain of a surgical procedure or the agony of a stroke-induced headache, but it also induced vivid, often terrifying hallucinations. You watch as the king is given a small cup of this concoction. His eyes, which were darting around the room in a fit of restless anxiety, slowly begin to heavy. This is the mandrake high, a deep, dark descent into a chemical slumber. To Edward, the walls of the lodge, hung with the trophies of 1,000 hunts, probably begin to morph. The antlers on the wall might seem to grow, reaching out like skeletal fingers. The flickering shadows from the hearth, the lodge's flickering orange alarm clocks dance across his face, making him look like a waxwork of himself. He isn't just sleeping, he's traveling through a landscape of blurred memories and drugged visions of his victories at Crécy and Poitiers. Being an apprentice in this room is a high-stakes job. You have to monitor the king's breathing, which has become slow and shallow. Historians still argue whether the use of such potent soporifics like dwale contributed to the cognitive decline of Edward III in his final years, leading to the period where his mistress, Alice Perrers, effectively ran the court. It's a classic cautionary tale of the fix becoming the problem. Did the king lose his grip on the kingdom because his brain was being regularly reset by the medieval equivalent of a factory wipe via mandrake root? The sensory details of the lodge are dense and earthy. There's the smell of the damp rushes on the floor, the metallic scent of the king's silver goblet, and the cloying sweet and sour aroma of the dwale itself. You remember the Crusader high of Richard? That was about action. This is about the opposite. It's the high of the void. It's about creating a space where the king doesn't have to be the greatest knight in Christendom for a few hours. He can just be a man who doesn't feel the weight of the crown or the failure of his aging limbs. But as he drifts deeper, the mandrake often brings the visions. The king mumbles in his sleep, talking to his deceased son, the Black Prince, or arguing with ghost versions of French kings he once thought he could easily replace. In this state, his chivalric fantasies become indistinguishable from reality. He is living in his own personal Camelot, fueled by a root that grew under a gallows tree. It's a haunting sight. The most powerful man in England, reduced to a dreaming child by a piece of wood and some vinegar. You trudge over to the fire to stir the embers, the warmth a welcome relief against the drafty lodge. You think about how every royal we visited has their own gatekeeper substance. For Edward, it's the root that screams. It's a fittingly dramatic choice for a man who lived his life as a grand performance. He isn't looking for the green morsels, clarity, or Henry's numbing plaster. He's looking for a total system override. As the night deepens and the king's snoring becomes the only sound in the room, you realize that history isn't just made of treaties and battles. It's made of these quiet, medicated moments where the people in charge are at their most vulnerable. The alarm clocks of the morning, the hunting horns, and the barking of the hounds will wake the lodge soon enough, and Edward will have to put on his robes and pretend he isn't a man being kept together by a hallucination. You close your eyes for a brief moment. The image of the gnarled mandrake root burned into your mind, and you hope that in his dreams, the king has finally found the victory he's been chasing his whole life. Tomorrow, the war continues. The crown remains heavy, and the physician will reach for his silver scale once more. The humid, earthy scent of the English hunting lodge and the gnarled visage of the mandrake root dissolve into the mist-shrouded, jagged peaks of the Scottish Highlands in the early 14th century. You are no longer in a place of chivalric pageantry. You're in a landscape of granite, gorse, and the relentless, biting wind of the north. The air here smells of peat smoke, salt from the nearby firths, and the metallic, cold scent of a sharpening stone. You are a personal physician to Robert the Bruce, the King of Scots. You are dressed in heavy, grease-treated wool that smells of sheep and campfire. Your boots worn thin from traversing the rocky, hidden paths of a king who spent much of his reign as a fugitive in his own land. Robert the Bruce is a man whose life is the ultimate underdog story, a warrior who clawed a kingdom out of the hands of the Plantagenets. One mainstream historical fact about Robert the Bruce is that he secured Scotland's independence at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, a victory so improbable it became the bedrock of Scottish national identity. But by the late 1320s, the hero king is a shadow of the man who wielded the great axe. He is suffering from what his contemporaries called a heavy sickness, which many modern scholars believe was leprosy. His skin is failing him. His joints are locked in a permanent, agonizing grip, and his body is a map of sores and exhaustion. You enter the king's private quarters, a sparse stone room in Cardross Castle. Robert is sitting by a peat fire, his hands bandaged in linen that is stained with herbal tinctures. He isn't looking for the crusader high of Richard or the Glass King's sedation. He needs a way to keep his mind sharp enough to secure the peace for his young son, David, while his physical form literally decays. To manage this, you are preparing a decoction of St. John's wort mixed with wild lettuce and henbane. This isn't just a tea, it's a potent hallucinogenic cocktail designed to act as a medieval nerve block. There is a quirky, fringe tidbit regarding Robert's treatment. According to some old Gaelic medical tracts, royal physicians in the north often utilized the king's cup, a mixture of potent alcohol and concentrated extracts of the Hyoscyamus niger henbane. It was rumored that this brew didn't just numb the pain, it allowed the king to walk among the spirits to seek guidance for his people. Imagine a medieval guerrilla leader who is essentially microdosing on nightshades to keep from screaming during a diplomatic meeting. It's a desperate chemical tightrope walk. You watch as the king takes a long draw from his wooden quaich. Almost immediately, the tension in his jaw releases. This is his Highland High, a state where the agonizing itch of his skin and the fire in his nerves are replaced by a cool, drifting numbness. To Robert, the flickering orange glow of the peat fire, the castle's silent ancient alarm clocks, might start to look like the campfires of his ancestors. He isn't just a dying man in a cold room. In his mind, he is back on the field. The wind in his hair and the weight of the claymore feeling light in his hand once more. Being a doctor to a legend is a heavy burden. You aren't just treating a patient, you are preserving a symbol. Historians still argue whether Robert the Bruce actually suffered from leprosy or if the sickness was a combination of severe psoriasis and the cumulative physical trauma of years spent living in damp caves and on the run. Whatever the diagnosis, the remedies you provide are a form of biological warfare against his own suffering. Medicine is really just polite torture with a theology degree, but in this drafty Scottish castle, it's the only thing keeping the crown on the king's head. The sensory details of this room are stark and haunting. There's the smell of the damp stone, the crackle of the peat, and the bitter, vegetal scent of the henbane steeping in the pot. You remember the Mandrake High of Edward III? This is grittier. There is no Arthurian fantasy here. This is about endurance. It's about a man who has lost his health but refuses to lose his kingdom. You see him staring into the flames, his eyes wide and unblinking, perhaps seeing the spider from the legend, the one that taught him to try again, spinning its web in the corner of the room. In his medicated state, that spider might look like a giant, shimmering architect of destiny. As the night progresses, the king begins to mumble in the old tongue, reciting the genealogies of the kings of Alba. The henbane has a way of unlocking the memory, but it also blurs the line between the past and the present. To him, the room is full of the ghosts of the men who died for him. James Douglas, Thomas Randolph, the brothers he lost to the English gallows. This isn't just a high, it's a wake. He is living through his life's work in a single night, fueled by a plant that grows on the edges of the wild. You trudge over to the window, looking out over the Clyde. The water is black and restless, reflecting a few lonely stars. You think about the green morsel and the silver water of the other royals. Robert's choice is the most honest of them all, a bitter herb for a bitter life. He isn't trying to be a god or a glass statue. He's just trying to be a king until the very last breath. As the king finally falls into a heavy, drug-induced sleep, the quaich slipping from his bandaged hand, you realize that history is forged in these moments of extreme fragility. The alarm clocks of the morning, the cry of the gulls, and the changing of the guard will wake him soon enough, and he will have to face the agonizing reality of his skin once again. You close your eyes for a second, the smell of peat and henbane lingering like a heavy shroud. Tomorrow, the king will wake, the pain will return, and you will reach for the dried leaves once more. You realize that the high isn't a luxury. It's a price of a kingdom. In the quiet of the Highland night, you hope the Bruce finds the peace in his sleep that the world has denied him in his waking hours. The scent of peat smoke and the damp, haunting silence of the Scottish Highlands drift away, replaced by the sharp, salt-crusted air of the Baltic Sea and the opulent, albeit chaotic atmosphere of 16th century Copenhagen. You are no longer standing in a sparse stone room, but in a grand banquet hall where the walls are draped with heavy Flemish tapestries, and the floors are strewn with fresh herbs meant to combat the smell of roasted swan and too much spilled ale. You are a court musician in the service of Christian II, the King of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. You are wearing a doublet of slashed velvet that is slightly too tight, and your fingers are calloused from hours of playing the lute. The air here is a thick, dizzying cocktail of expensive spices, roasting fats, and a persistent, underlying scent of fermented grain. Christian II is a man of dualities, a progressive reformer who sought to empower the common people, yet earned the nickname Christian the Tyrant after the bloodbath of Stockholm. One mainstream historical fact about Christian II is that his reign was marked by a desperate struggle to maintain the Kalmar Union, a political knot that tied Scandinavia together. He was a man who lived at a frantic pace, constantly moving, constantly plotting, and frequently hosting legendary banquets that were as much about psychological warfare as they were about food. But as you watch him from your position near the musicians' gallery, you notice that his energy isn't just natural charisma, it's being fueled by something much more volatile than simple ambition. You watch as the king presides over a table laden with silver trenchers. While his guests are busy gorging on meat, Christian is focused on a specific type of spiced wine known as hippocras. In the 16th century, this wasn't just a drink, it was a delivery system for a variety of exotic additives. Christian's personal blend, however, is rumored to contain more than just cinnamon and ginger. To keep his spirits high and his energy up during these marathon diplomatic sessions, his apothecaries have been adding extracts of wormwood and darnel. Darnel, a weed often found in wheat fields, was known in medieval Europe as infatuating grass because of its ability to cause a state of giddy, drunken-like euphoria and even blurred vision. There is a quirky, fringe tidbit regarding these Danish royal banquets. Guests often reported that the king would enter a state of manic joy, laughing uncontrollably and making grand, impossible promises, only to crash into a deep, dark melancholy before the sun rose. Some contemporary chroniclers whispered that the king was bewitched by his mistress, Didvek Sigbridsdatter, and her mother, Sigbrit Willems, who acted as his chief advisor. It was rumored that Sigbrit, a woman of common birth with a deep knowledge of herbalism, prepared special invigorating cordials for the king. Imagine a 16th century monarch who is essentially being managed by a mother-daughter duo using herbal boosters to keep him functional and compliant. It's a medieval version of a high-stakes political thriller where the secret ingredient is literally in the soup. You watch as the king takes a deep draught from his golden goblet. Almost instantly, his eyes brighten with a frantic, glassy sheen. This is his Baltic high, a state of chemical confidence where he feels he can outmaneuver the Hanseatic League and crush the Swedish nobility in a single stroke. To Christian, the sound of the trumpets, the hall's blaring brass alarm clocks, doesn't signal the end of a course. It sounds like a herald of his inevitable glory. He starts to speak rapidly, his ideas jumping from tax reform to naval expansion with a speed that leaves his advisors blinking in confusion. He is a man riding a wave of herbal stimulation, a king who believes his own hype because his brain is being tickled by the toxic alkaloids of the darnel. Being a musician in this court is like being a soundtrack composer for a slow-motion train wreck. You have to keep the music upbeat even when you can see the king's hands start to tremble or his temper begin to fray. Historians still argue whether Christian II's erratic behavior and ultimate downfall were the result of a genuine mental illness or the consequence of long-term exposure to tainted food and drink prepared by his unconventional advisors. It's the ultimate palace intrigue mystery. Was he a visionary leader or a puppet of the apothecary's cabinet? Medicine is really just polite torture with a theology degree, but in the Danish court, it was also a tool of political influence. The sensory details of the banquet are overwhelming. There is the heat from the massive fireplaces that makes the sweat prickle under your velvet doublet. There is the taste of the heavy, honeyed wine that lingers on your own tongue during your breaks. There is the sight of the king, his face flushed and his movements jerky, looking less like a sovereign and more like a marionette with too many strings. You remember the Highland High of Robert the Bruce? That was about quiet endurance. This is the opposite. This is a loud, messy public performance of power fueled by a substance that makes the world seem smaller and more manageable than it actually is. One of the most chilling aspects of Christian's high was the Stockholm bloodbath of 1520. After being crowned King of Sweden and promising an amnesty, he held a 3-day feast that ended with the execution of nearly 100 Swedish nobles and clergy. Imagine the psychological state of a man who can pivot from a grand celebratory banquet to a mass execution in the span of a few hours. Was his conscience numbed by the same wormwood-infused wine he was serving his guests? It's a dark, lingering question that haunts the history of the North. As the night finally winds down and the guests begin to pass out on the benches, you see the king's facade start to crumble. The Darnell High is a cruel mistress. The euphoria is rapidly being replaced by a crushing paranoia. He begins to whisper to Sigbrit, his eyes darting toward the shadows behind the tapestries. He is no longer the magnificent ruler. He is a frightened man who realizes he has made too many enemies. You trudge back to your own small room in the palace, your ears still ringing from the music and the shouting. You think about how every royalty we've met uses their substance as a shield. For Christian, it's a shield against his own inadequacies and the crushing weight of a collapsing union. He isn't looking for the mandrake's sleep or the silver water's rage. He's looking for the illusion of control. He wants to feel like the master of the Baltic, even if that feeling only lasts as long as the wine in his cup. As you lie down on your bed, the scratchy wool of your blanket finally feeling cool against your skin, you realize that history is often just a series of bad decisions made by people who were too high on their own power or their own medicine to see the consequences. The alarm clocks of the morning, the cold North Sea wind whistling through the ramparts will wake the city soon enough, and Christian will have to face the fallout of his banquet logic. You close your eyes, the image of the king's frantic, glassy stare the last thing you see, and you hope that in your dreams there is a world where kings drink only water and the music never has to hide the sound of a falling axe. The sharp, brine-crusted air of the Baltic and the manic energy of Christian's Danish banquets fade into a much softer, more golden light. You are now standing in the late 12th century in the rolling, sun-drenched vineyards of Aquitaine in what is now southwestern France. The air here doesn't bite or freeze, it caresses. It smells of ripening grapes, crushed lavender, and the expensive, floral musk of a court that prizes beauty above almost all else. You are a troubadourette, a female troubadour, at the court of love, presided over by Eleanor of Aquitaine. You are wearing a gown of fine light silk that feels like a second skin, a far cry from the itchy wool of the northern marches. Your fingers are nimble from plucking the strings of a gittern, and your mind is sharp, tasked with weaving verses that are as intoxicating as the liquids being passed around a stone terrace. Eleanor is perhaps the most formidable woman of the Middle Ages, a queen of both France and England, and a woman who truly understood the power of the vibe. One mainstream historical fact about Eleanor of Aquitaine is that she was the primary patron of the courtly love movement, transforming the rough and tumble warrior culture of the time into something more refined, poetic, and, to be honest, highly romanticized. But creating a culture of grand gestures and burning passion requires more than just good poetry. It requires a bit of chemical assistance to lower the inhibitions of the rough nights and keep the ladies of the court in a state of heightened emotional receptivity. In the sun-soaked courts of the South, this assistance came in the form of courtly tinctures and spiced herbal wines known as piment. You watch as Eleanor, regal and serene even in her later years, oversees a gathering of knights and poets. They aren't drinking the heavy, sludge-like ale of the north. They are sipping translucent, amber-colored wines infused with rosemary, sage, and something the locals call clove pinks. But there is a quirky fringe tidbit about Eleanor's legendary courts. It was whispered that her love potions weren't just metaphors. Her personal apothecaries were masters of blending mild sedatives like valerian with stimulating herbs like savory, and even small controlled amounts of Spanish fly or powdered beetles intended to act as aphrodisiacs. Imagine a medieval version of a high-end rooftop lounge where the signature cocktails are specifically designed to make everyone fall in love with the person sitting next to them. It was a sensory-engineered environment, a palace-wide experiment in social chemistry. You watch a young knight take a sip of a specially prepared wine. Within minutes, his posture relaxes and the warrior's squint leaves his eyes. This is the Aquitaine High, a state of refined, sensory-rich euphoria. To the courtiers, the sound of your gittern, the court's gentle, melodic alarm clocks, doesn't signal a task to be done. It sounds like the very heartbeat of the world. They aren't just drinking to get drunk. They are drinking to reach a state of fin amour, a refined love that feels like a spiritual experience. Medicine is really just polite torture with a theology degree, but in Eleanor's court, the medicine was designed to heal the soul through the senses. Being a performer in this court is like being a DJ at a very sophisticated, very exclusive party where you are responsible for the emotional temperature of the room. You have to know when to play a mournful ballad to lean into the melancholy of love, and when to speed it up to match the herbal stimulation of the wine. Historians still argue whether Eleanor's courts of love were actual judicial bodies where romantic disputes were settled, or if they were essentially a 12th century version of performance art, a highly staged, drug and music-fueled escape from the brutal political realities of her life. Was she a romantic visionary or a brilliant propagandist who used sensory pleasure to domesticate a violent aristocracy? The sensory details of Aquitaine are exquisite. There is the taste of the wine which hits the back of your throat with a spicy, floral heat. There is the sight of the sunlight filtering through the trellis, casting a pattern of leaves across Eleanor's face that makes her look like a forest goddess. There is the smell of the roses, so thick it's almost cloying, mixing with the scent of the beeswax used to polish the lutes. You remember the Baltic high of Christian II? That was a jagged, frantic thing. This is fluid. This is a high that makes you want to write a sonnet rather than start a war. It's the high of the aesthete, the person who believes that a perfectly turned phrase is worth more than a castle. However, even this golden dream had a darker side. The piment and the tinctures could lead to a profound disconnection from the world outside the palace walls. While Eleanor and her courtiers were debating the merit of unrequited love, the real world of crusades, taxes, and dynastic betrayals was still churning. You've seen Eleanor in the quiet moments when the music stops and the tinctures wear off. She is a woman who spent years in a literal prison at the hands of her husband, Henry II. The high of the court was her way of reclaiming her agency, of building a world where she set the rules and where the only pain was the sweet ache of a poetic heart. You trudge across the terrace as the stars begin to poke through the twilight. The scent of the night-blooming jasmine begins to take over, a heavy, intoxicating aroma that feels like a physical weight. You think about the mandrake and the poppy of the other kings. Eleanor's high is the most sophisticated of all because it's disguised as culture. She isn't numbing a wound or fueling a rage. She's decorating reality until the original shape of it is hidden under layers of silk and song. As the last of the wine is drained and the courtiers begin to retreat to their chambers, you see Eleanor standing alone by the stone balustrade. She looks out over her lands, her silhouette sharp against the fading light. She is a queen who won her battles, not just with knights, but with the very air her subjects breathed. You realize that history is made by those who can control the narrative, and Eleanor used every tool at her disposal, including the contents of the apothecary's jar, to make sure her narrative was the most beautiful one. You lie down on your bed, the silk of your gown a cool luxury. The alarm clocks of the morning, the song of the nightingale, and the ringing of the chapel bells will wake you soon, and you will have to begin the performance again. You close your eyes, the image of the amber wine and the sound of the gittern lingering in your mind. Tomorrow, the court of love will reconvene, the tinctures will be poured, and for a few hours the world will be exactly as Eleanor of Aquitaine wants it to be. You realize that a high isn't always an escape. Sometimes it's a construction, a beautiful, fragile fortress built to keep the darkness of the Middle Ages at bay. The golden, silk-draped terraces of Aquitaine and the refined, poetic high of Eleanor's court evaporate like a dream, replaced by the damp, oppressive atmosphere of early 13th century England. You are no longer in a world of refined love. You are in a world of cold stone, flickering shadows, and a smell that can only be described as anxiety. It's a scent of damp wool, iron, and a heavy medicinal aroma that sticks to the back of your throat. You are a member of the royal wardrobe in the court of King John, Eleanor's youngest son, and arguably the most hated man to ever wear the English crown. You are wearing a heavy tunic of undyed wool that feels like a constant abrasive against your skin, and your boots are perpetually caked in the thick grey mud of the Thames Valley. King John is a man defined by his failures, losing the crown jewels in a swamp, losing his French territories, and being forced to sign the Magna Carta by a group of barons who would have much preferred to see his head on a pike. One mainstream historical fact about King John is that he was a man of immense administrative energy. He traveled his kingdom more than almost any other monarch, effectively inventing the idea of a working court. But this energy was fueled by a deep-seated, vibrating paranoia. John lived in a state of constant fear that he was being poisoned, betrayed, or simply laughed at. To manage this vibrating brain, he turned to the most complex and expensive drug of the Middle Ages, theriac. You watch as John sits in his private chamber, his eyes darting toward every sound, the scrape of a mouse, the rustle of a curtain, the distant tolling of a church bell. To him, these sounds aren't just noises, they are the world's aggressive alarm clocks reminding him that he is never safe. To combat this, he consumes theriac, a panacea that contained over 60 ingredients including viper's flesh, opium, and various rare herbs. While it was marketed as a universal antidote to poison, its heavy opium content made it a powerful sedative. Imagine a medieval version of someone who is so stressed they are essentially self-medicating with a high-dose liquid sedative just to get through a meeting without screaming at the walls. There is a quirky, fringe tidbit regarding John's specific brand of high. He was obsessed with the quality of his ingredients. He would spend astronomical sums of money on true theriac from Venice, believing that only the most expensive substances could shield him from the evil humors of his court. Some chroniclers noted that the king often appeared in a state of heavy-lidded contemplation during moments of crisis. He wasn't being calm, he was chemically checked out. He was using the theriac to build a wall between his fragile ego and the cold, hard reality that his kingdom was falling apart. It's a tragic sort of high. The high of the besieged, a man trying to numb his way through a catastrophe of his own making. You watch as the king takes a small silver spoon of the dark, syrupy substance. The effect is almost instantaneous. The frantic drumming of his fingers on the table slows down. The sharp, suspicious glint in his eye softens into a dull, glassy stare. This is his paranoid high. A state where the world is finally quiet enough for him to think he's in control. Medicine back then was really just polite torture with a theology degree, but for John, it was his only friend. He didn't trust his barons, he didn't trust his wife, but he trusted the silver spoon and the Venetian syrup. Being a servant in John's court is like walking on eggshells that are also on fire. You have to be invisible. If he notices you, he might suspect you of being a spy for the Pope or the French king. Historians still argue whether King John's erratic decision-making and black moods were a symptom of a clinical personality disorder, like borderline personality disorder, or if his mind was simply eroded by the constant use of heavy narcotics to manage his crippling anxiety. It's a fascinating, dark possibility. Was the Magna Carta signed by a man who was essentially in a drug-induced stupor, just trying to make the shouting barons go away so he could return to his quiet, syrupy darkness? The sensory details of John's court are claustrophobic. There is the smell of the charcoal brazier, which provides a dry, choking heat. There is the taste of the stale bread and watered-down wine, which are tested by a taster before John touches them. There is the sight of the king's Zikrok's discarded cloak, made of fine velvet but stained with the sweat of his constant agitation. You remember the Aquitaine High of his mother, Eleanor? That was about expanding the world. This is about shrinking it. This is a high designed to make the room feel small and the problems feel far away. One of the most famous legends of John's reign is his loss of the royal treasure in the Wash, a treacherous bay in East Anglia. As the tide rose and swallowed his gold, his crowns, and his dignity, John reportedly fell into a feverish state. Many believe this fever was exacerbated by a heavy dose of theriac taken to calm his nerves after the disaster. Imagine the king sitting on the muddy shore, watching his empire's wealth vanish beneath the waves, while his brain is swimming in a haze of viper flesh and poppy. It's the ultimate bad trip, a moment where the chemical buffer finally fails to hide the scale of the loss. As the night deepens, the king begins to mumble about the interdict, the period when the Pope banned all church services in England. To a medieval man, this was like the spiritual internet being cut off for an entire country. To John, in his medicated state, the silence of the church bells probably felt like a physical weight, a cosmic judgment he couldn't escape. He wanders the dark corridors of his castle, his shadow flickering against the stone like a frightened bird. He isn't seeking a vision or a glory, he's just seeking a moment where he doesn't feel like the entire world is his enemy. You trudge back to your own pallet, the cold dampness of the castle walls seeping into your bones. You think about the mandrake and the wormwood of the other kings. John's choice is the most desperate, a complex, expensive lie in a bottle. He isn't looking for the green morsels, peace. He's looking for an armor he can wear on the inside. As the king finally falls into a heavy, snoring sleep, the silver spoon lying on the floor like a discarded toy, you realize that history isn't just a series of dates. It's a story of people trying to survive their own minds. The alarm clocks of the morning, the clatter of the guards' spears, and the shouting of the stable hands will wake the king soon enough, and the paranoia will come rushing back like the tide at the Wash. You close your eyes, the smell of theriac and wood smoke lingering in your mind, and you realize that a crown is just a piece of metal, but a mind is a kingdom that can be lost much more easily. Tomorrow the king will wake, he will call for his spoon, and the struggle to stay high above his own fear will begin all over again. The damp, paranoid corridors of King John's England and the cloying smell of viper flesh, theriac, dissolve into the chilling, calculated atmosphere of late 15th century France. You are no longer standing in a world of loud, panicked failures. You are in a world of whispers, hidden doors, and a pervasive sense of being watched by 1,000 eyes you cannot see. The air here smells of old parchment, cold stone, and a sharp herbal bitterness that seems to seep from the very floorboards. You are a clerk of the royal household in the Château de Plessis-les-Tours, the fortress home of Louis XV, known to history as the Spider King. You are wearing a simple, dark tunic of fine but unadorned wool. Luxury here is a liability, and your boots are soft leather, designed for silent movement through a palace where everyone is a potential informant. Louis XV is a man who treated kingship like a game of three-dimensional chess played in a dark room. One mainstream historical fact about Louis XV is that he is the architect of the modern French state, breaking the power of the great feudal lords and centralizing authority through a mix of ruthless diplomacy and a truly terrifying network of spies. He was a man who hated the traditional trappings of royalty. He wore old, greasy hats and preferred the company of his barber and his physician to that is of princes. But this cold, logical exterior masked a mind that was perpetually frayed by insomnia and a profound, bone-deep fear of death. To keep the spider weaving his web, he relied on a specific hallucinogenic high derived from the nightshade family, specifically mandrake syrup. You trudge through the narrow, winding stairs of the chateau, the cold dampness of the stone walls biting through your sleeves. You are heading toward the king's private study, a room so cluttered with maps and reports it looks more like a 15th century newsroom than a royal chamber. Louis is hunched over a desk, his face a map of deep lines and restless energy. He hasn't slept in a bed for years, preferring to doze in a chair or on a pile of cushions, always with a weapon within reach. To manage the nightly terrors that plagued his waking hours, his physician, Jacques Coitier, a man who managed to squeeze a literal fortune out of the king's hypochondria, provided him with a syrup of mandrake and wine. There is a quirky fringe tidbit regarding the Spider King's medicinal habits. He was so terrified of being poisoned that he forced Coitier to taste every single drop of his medicine before he would touch it. But more than that, Louis believed that the mandrake gave him prophetic dreams that allowed him to see the moves of his enemies before they made them. Imagine a medieval head of state who is essentially microdosing on hallucinogens to fuel his political intuition. It's like a 15th century version of a Silicon Valley tech mogul using mind-expanding substances to predict market trends, except the market is the Duchy of Burgundy and the trends are assassination plots. You watch as the king takes a small, cautious sip from a vial. Almost immediately, the frantic twitching of his eyelid stops. This is his spider high, a state of heightened, albeit distorted, focus. To Louis, the shadows in the corners of the room, the palace's flickering, silent alarm clocks, don't just look like darkness, they look like patterns. In his medicated state, he sees connection where others see chaos. He isn't seeking the Aquitaine High's beauty or the Crusaders' bravery. He's seeking the high of the ultimate predator. Medicine back then was really just polite torture with a theology degree. But for Louis, it was a tool for statecraft. Being a clerk in this court is like being a small insect, caught in the corner of a very large, very complex web. You have to be precise. One mistake in a transcription could lead to a misunderstanding that results in a nobleman being locked in one of the king's famous iron cages. Historians still argue whether Louis David Armin III's extreme paranoia and bizarre lifestyle were the result of a clinical obsessive-compulsive disorder or if his madness was a carefully cultivated persona designed to keep his enemies off balance while he was actually under the influence of his potent herbal tinctures. It's a chilling thought. Was the map of modern France drawn by a man whose brain was being marinated in mandrake and fear? The sensory details of the chateau are sparse and sharp. There is the smell of the ink, which is metallic and stinging. There is the taste of the cold, thin broth the king insists everyone eat to avoid sloth. There is the sound of the wind whistling through the iron bars of the windows, the only music the Spider King seems to enjoy. You remember the Mandrake High of Edward III? That was a descent into a dream of the past. For Louis, it's an ascent into a nightmare of the future. He isn't looking for sleep, he's looking for a way to stay awake without losing his mind. One of the most famous aspects of his reign was his rivalry with Charles the Bold of Burgundy. Louis defeated him not on the battlefield, but through a series of betrayals, bribes, and chemical patience. He would wait in his dark chateau, sipping his syrup, watching his web vibrate until his enemy was entangled and exhausted. Imagine the king sitting in the dark, his pupils dilated from the nightshade, laughing quietly to himself as he receives news of a Burgundian defeat. It's the ultimate high of the puppet master, a man who has replaced his soul with a ledger and his blood with a decoction of roots. As the night drags on, the king begins to mumble about his little saints. The lead figures of saints he kept pinned to his greasy hat and to whom he would pray for forgiveness for the murders he hadn't even committed yet. To a normal person, this is madness. To Louis, in his medicated state, these figures were a direct line to the divine, a way to balance the books of his conscience. He wanders the torchlit halls, a stooped, frail figure who holds the fate of millions in his ink-stained hands. He isn't seeking a glory, he's seeking a survival that he knows, deep down, is impossible. You trudge back to your own small pallet, the silence of the fortress ringing in your ears. You think about the poppy and the wormwood of the other kings. Louis's choice is the most calculating, a drug used as a weapon of the mind. He isn't looking for an escape. He's looking for a vantage point. As the king finally settles into a shallow, fitful doze, his hand still clutching a roll of parchment, you realize that history is often made in these quiet, cold rooms by people who are too afraid to close their eyes. The alarm clocks of the morning, the grinding of the portcullis, and the distant cry of a sentry will wake the spider soon enough, and the weaving of the web will begin again. You close your eyes, the smell of ink and mandrake lingering in your mind, and you realize that a kingdom can be built on a foundation of stone, but it's held together by the chemicals that allow a king to endure his own ambition. Tomorrow the king will wake, he will call for his physician, and the cold, herbal logic of the Spider King will continue to shape the world. The cold, calculated whispers of the Spider King's fortress and the bitter tang of his mandrake syrup dissolve into the shimmering, chaotic light of the 15th century Holy Roman Empire. You are no longer in a world of dark webs and silent clerks. You are in a world of clashing bronze, bubbling glass retorts, and a smell that is both heavenly and terrifying, a mix of sulfur, distilled spirits, and rare spices. The air here is thick with the heat of 100 furnaces and the frantic energy of a court that believes it is on the verge of cracking the code of the universe. You are an alchemist's apprentice in the service of Sigismund of Luxembourg, the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Hungary and Bohemia. You are wearing a heavy apron of scorched leather over your wool tunic, and your eyebrows are perpetually singed from peering into the philosopher's fire. Sigismund is a man of grand, almost exhausting vision, a ruler who spent his life trying to heal the great schism of the church and defend Europe from the Ottoman tide. One mainstream historical fact about Sigismund is that he was the driving force behind the Council of Constance, which finally ended the mess of having 3 popes at once. He was the ultimate medieval fixer, a man who lived at the center of a whirlwind of diplomacy and war. But Sigismund was also a man of his time, and his time was obsessed with the transformative power of alchemy. While others were seeking a high to numb their pain or fuel their rage, Sigismund was seeking the golden high, the literal and spiritual transcendence promised by the alchemical great work. You trudge through the vaulted laboratories of the imperial court, your boots crunching on spilled charcoal and broken glass. Sigismund is there, hunched over a steaming vessel, his face illuminated by the eerie, greenish glow of a chemical reaction. He isn't looking for a simple sedative, he is consuming potable gold and distilled spirits known as aqua vitae. In the 15th century, these weren't just drinks, they were the medieval version of a limitless pill. Alchemists claimed that gold, when rendered into a liquid state through secret processes, could grant eternal life and a mind that could perceive the hidden harmonies of the spheres. Imagine a modern tech bro who spends millions on longevity protocols and experimental brain boosters, except his lab is a drafty castle and his supplements involve heavy metals and high-proof grain alcohol. There is a quirky, fringe tidbit regarding Sigismund's experiments. It was rumored that his favorite alchemist once prepared a golden tincture that included crushed pearls, saffron, and a substance called mercury of the philosophers. The emperor would drink this concoction before major diplomatic sessions, believing it gave his voice the weight of a god. This wasn't just a metaphor for influence. The high levels of alcohol and potentially psychoactive plant extracts in these elixirs created a state of intense, shimmering euphoria. He wasn't just a king, he was a man who felt like he was becoming the sun. It's a sensory-rich high. The high of the would-be immortal. A man who believes he is vibrating at a higher frequency than the rest of humanity. You watch as the emperor takes a deep, burning draught from a crystal vial. Almost immediately, his eyes widen and a flush of heat spreads across his face. This is his imperial high, a state of chemical confidence where the impossible task of unifying Christendom seems like a simple afternoon's work. To Sigismund, the bubbling of the retorts, the lab's frantic, boiling alarm clocks sounds like the very music of creation. He starts to speak in grand, sweeping gestures about the final crusade and the city of gold. He is a man intoxicated by the dream of perfection, a ruler who has replaced the mundane world with a shimmering alchemical hallucination. Being an apprentice in this court is like being a safety inspector in a fireworks factory during a thunderstorm. You have to keep the fires at the exact temperature while avoiding the toxic fumes of lead and arsenic that hang in the air like a heavy, invisible fog. Historians still argue whether Sigismund's legendary energy and his ability to juggle a dozen different political crises at once were the result of a uniquely robust constitution, or if he was effectively overclocking his nervous system with the help of distilled spirits and alchemical stimulants. Medicine is really just polite torture with a theology degree, but in the emperor's lab, it was a quest for divinity. The sensory details of the alchemical court are intense. There is the smell of the dragon's blood, a type of red resin, which is sweet and smoky. There is a taste of the aqua vitae, which burns like a liquid sword and leaves a trail of fire in your throat. There is the sight of the gold leaf fluttering in the draughts, looking like the scales of a mythical beast. You remember the spider high of Louis de Boin? That was about shrinking the world to a point of control. This is about expanding the world until it bursts. This is a high that makes you believe you can turn lead into gold and men into angels. One of the most famous aspects of Sigismund's reign was his constant movement. He was forever traveling between Prague, Buda, and the cities of Germany, always searching for the funds and the allies to complete his work. To keep up this pace, he relied on his golden high to bridge the gap between his mortal exhaustion and his imperial duty. Imagine the emperor arriving at a city gate after weeks on the road, his mind racing with the effects of his potable gold, looking to the citizens like a creature of pure light, while his body is actually screaming for a week of sleep. It's the ultimate performance, fueled by a bottle of fire and a dream of eternity. As the night drags on, the emperor begins to mumble about the Athanor, the furnace of the soul. To a normal person, this is abstract philosophy. To Sigismund, in his medicated state, the furnace is real, and he is the one being forged. He wanders among the glowing coals, his shadow dancing like a titan against the laboratory walls. He isn't seeking a quiet prayer or a secret web. He's seeking the moment where the stone is found and the world is finally, perfectly healed. You trudge back to your own small pallet in the corner of the workshop, the smell of charcoal and spirits clinging to your hair. You think about the mandrake and the thyak of the other royals. Sigismund's choice is the most optimistic, a drug used as a ladder to the heavens. He isn't looking for an escape. He's looking for a transformation. As the emperor finally settles into a heavy, warmth-filled doze by the furnace, his hand still resting on a volume of Hermes Trismegistus, you realize that history is often driven by those who refuse to accept the limits of being human. The alarm clocks of the morning, the hammering of the blacksmiths, and the tolling of the cathedral bells will wake the emperor soon enough, and the quest for the gold will begin again. You close your eyes, the image of the green fire and the golden tincture lingering in your mind, and you realize that a crown is a heavy thing, but the hope of immortality is the heaviest weight of all. Tomorrow the sun will rise, the lead will remain lead, and the emperor will take another sip of the fire to keep the dream alive. The golden heat of Sigismund's alchemical furnaces and the scent of burning sulfur fade into the thin, crisp air of the Elburz Mountains in 12th century Persia. You are no longer in a world of European kings and their frantic quest for gold. You are in a landscape of jagged gray peaks and hidden valleys where the very rocks seem to hold their breath. You are standing on a narrow, winding path leading toward Alamut, the eagle's nest, a fortress that looks less like a building and more like it grew naturally out of the mountain's spine. You are wearing a simple, rugged robe of dark wool that's been dusty for weeks, and your boots are worn from climbing. You aren't a king, but a new recruit in the service of Hassan-i-Sabah, the old man of the mountain. Hassan-i-Sabah is the ultimate master of the high. While the monarchs we've met use substances to cope with their power, Hassan used them to create it. One mainstream historical fact about Hassan-i-Sabah is that he was the founder of the Order of Assassins, the Nizari Ismailis, a group that managed to terrify the most powerful leaders of the medieval world from their remote mountain strongholds. He wasn't just a warlord, he was a brilliant scholar, a mathematician, and a master of psychological warfare. But his most enduring legend involves the use of hashish to create a literal paradise on earth for his followers. You trudge through the final gate of the fortress, the silence of the high altitudes ringing in your ears. You are led into a small, windowless room where a single oil lamp flickers, the fortress's quiet, lonely alarm clocks. Here you are given a bowl of sweet, thick milk mixed with a concentrated resin. This is the Hashishin high, but it's not for your pleasure, it's for your conversion. Imagine a medieval version of a high-resolution VR simulation, a try before you buy, marketing scheme for the afterlife. Hassan wasn't just giving his men a drug, he was giving them a reason to die. There is a quirky fringe tidbit that suggests the word assassin itself comes from the Arabic hashishin, meaning users of hashish. While it's a great story, many scholars point out it was likely a derogatory term used by their enemies to suggest the assassins were just drug-crazed fanatics rather than highly trained political operatives. Imagine being the medieval version of a top-tier special forces unit, only for your rivals to post on the 12th century version of Reddit that you only won because you were tripping on grass. You watch as the room begins to tilt and blur. The milk tastes of honey and something dark and piney. As the hashish takes hold, you are carried, or perhaps you imagine you are carried, into a secret, hidden valley within the castle walls. This is the high sovereign high. You wake up in a garden that shouldn't exist in these barren mountains. There are fountains flowing with milk and wine, trees heavy with exotic fruits, and beautiful people who attend to your every need. To your drugged brain, the sensory detail is overwhelming. The silk of the cushions feels like water. The scent of the lilies is so thick it's like a physical weight. You are convinced you have reached the Jannah, the paradise promised to the faithful. Being a recruit here is like being part of a 12th century cult that also happens to be a world-class intelligence agency. You are being hacked. Historians still argue whether the legend of the Paradise Garden was a literal truth, a physical garden built by Hassan to deceive his men, or a piece of crusader propaganda designed to dehumanize their enemies by claiming they were only brave because they were drugged. Either way, the psychological result was the same. A man who believes he has already seen heaven is a man who has no fear of the blade. The sensory details of the paradise are intoxicating. There is a taste of the chilled pomegranate juice that stains your lips. There is the sound of the lutes playing a melody that seems to vibrate through your very bones. There is the sight of the emerald green grass, so vivid it makes your eyes ache. You remember the imperial high of Sigismund? That was a quest for something he couldn't reach. This is a gift of something you can't bear to leave. It's a high designed to break your will and replace it with absolute loyalty. After a few days of this bliss, you are drugged again and wake up back in the cold, gray reality of the stone fortress. The contrast is devastating. The air is thin and freezing. The food is hard bread and water. The silence of the mountains is deafening. You look at Hassani Saba, and he tells you that if you follow his orders, if you strike down the enemies of the faith, you will return to that garden forever. This is the ultimate high as a tool of statecraft. Medicine is really just polite torture with a theology degree, and in Alamut, the medicine was the promise of an eternal escape from the torture of life. You trudge back to your post on the ramparts, the cold wind whipping at your wool robe. You think about the mandrake of the French kings and the poppy of the Ottomans. Those were shields. Hassan's hashish was a bridge. He didn't want his men to be numb. He wanted them to be motivated. He used the high to turn a group of mountain dwellers into the most feared shadow army in history. As the sun sets over the Elburz peaks, turning the snow to a bruised purple, you realize that history is often built on these manufactured visions. From the Glass King of Paris to the Old Man of the Mountain, the story of medieval royalty is a story of humans trying to transcend the limits of their time, their pain, and their mortality. The high wasn't a distraction, it was the engine of their ambition or the only solace for their failure. Word count 1045. The mountain peaks of Alamut are beginning to fade now, the sharp outlines of the fortress dissolving into a soft charcoal mist. The cold wind of the high passes is softening, turning into a gentle, rhythmic hum that surrounds you like a warm blanket. You are safe. You are back in your own time, in your own bed, and the heavy weight of history is lifting off your shoulders. Your breathing is slowing down, deep and steady, matching the quiet pulse of the night. The itchy wool and the cold stone are gone, replaced by the cool, smooth touch of your sheets. The smells of incense, old lilies, and wood smoke are drifting away, leaving only the clean, neutral scent of your room. You don't have to be a king. You don't have to be a knight. You don't have to be a spy. You are just you, and the world is quiet. Imagine the flickering torches of the palaces we visited being snuffed out, one by one. The alarm clocks of the past, the church bells, the trumpets, the clattering of spears have all fallen silent. The desert sands have covered the paths. The vines have overgrown the castle walls. The great highs and the terrible lows of the monarchs have all settled into the dust of the archives. There is nothing left to decide, nothing left to win, and nowhere left to go. You are drifting now, floating on a calm, dark sea where the ripples of the past can't reach you. The stories of the Glass King and the Spider King are just echoes, growing fainter and fainter until they are nothing but a whisper. Your eyelids are heavy, so very heavy, and the darkness is kind. Let the images fade, let the voices go. You are sinking into a deep, restorative sleep where the only crown you wear is a crown of dreams. Sleep now, rest. The journey is over and the night is yours.